What if the blood in your veins carries a secret older than the flood, one scripture warned us about, but never fully explained? Genesis 6 is only 8 verses long. 8. And yet those 8 verses have troubled rabbis, confused priests, and unsettled ordinary readers for over 3,000 years. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Read that again. Not a metaphor, not a parable. A recorded event, sitting quietly in the first book of the Bible, describing something so strange that most modern churches simply skip past it on a Sunday morning. Who were the sons of God? Scripture itself answers that question elsewhere, and the answer is not comfortable. In the book of Job, the phrase "sons of God" refers directly to heavenly beings who stood in the presence of the Almighty. Not men, not a poetic title for righteous humans, angelic beings with will, with desire, with the terrible freedom to disobey. And in Genesis 6, some of them looked down at the daughters of men and chose to cross a line that was never meant to be crossed. The offspring of that union were called Nephilim. The word itself in the original Hebrew carries the root meaning to fall, the fallen ones. Genesis 6 verse 4 states plainly that there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. This was not a footnote in ancient memory. It was a bloodline that shaped the earliest legends of nearly every civilization that came after it. Here is where the story becomes something you were probably never told in Sunday school. The Book of Enoch, quoted directly in the New Testament by the Apostle Jude, expands on this event in devastating detail. 200 watchers, angelic beings assigned to observe humanity, descended upon Mount Hermon and bound themselves by oath to take wives from among mortal women. Their leader was named Semjaza. Their children did not simply grow tall. According to Enoch's account, they grew monstrous, consuming the food of men until nothing remained, then turning against humanity itself, devouring flesh and drinking blood. This is not exaggeration for dramatic effect. This is the text as it was preserved for thousands of years by communities who believed it carried real spiritual weight. Jude verse 6 confirms a piece of this account with chilling brevity. And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. Left their own habitation. That phrase alone should stop you. It means these beings had a place, a role in the created order, and they abandoned it. Second, Peter chapter 2 repeats the same warning, describing angels who sinned being cast down and delivered into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. 2 separate apostles, writing to 2 separate audiences, referencing the same ancient catastrophe as if their readers already understood exactly what they meant. So why does this matter now in your own century, in your own body? Because the question this video is built around is not simply did this happen? The question is what happened to that bloodline after the flood supposedly wiped it out? Genesis 6 verse 4 contains 4 words that scholars have argued over for centuries, and also after that. After the flood. After Noah, after the ark, after the waters receded, and the earth was supposedly cleansed of the corruption that caused God to grieve he had made man, the Nephilim were still there. Numbers chapter 13 records the spies sent into Canaan returning in terror, reporting that they had seen giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the Nephilim, and that they themselves seemed like grasshoppers in comparison. This was centuries after the flood. The bloodline had not been erased. It had scattered, hidden, and taken root in the very land that would one day be promised to Israel. The book of Jasher, referenced twice in the canonical Bible itself, in Joshua and in 2 Samuel, adds another layer to this account that few believers have ever encountered. It describes the sons of men and the sons of God intermarrying openly, producing offspring so violent and so consumed by appetite that the earth itself became filled with corruption, exactly as Genesis describes in the verses leading up to the flood. The Genesis Apocryphon, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves of Qumran, goes even further, recording Lamech's own suspicion that his newborn son Noah was not fully human, that his radiant appearance made Lamech question whether one of the watchers had visited his household. This was not a fringe belief invented by a handful of eccentric scribes. It was a memory so persistent that it kept surfacing across centuries, across different communities in Hebrew, in Aramaic, in Greek translation, refusing to be forgotten. Archaeology has not stayed silent on this either. At Baalbek, in modern Lebanon, sits a stone platform built from blocks so massive that no crane in existence today could lift them into place. The largest, known as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighs over 1,000 tons. Local legend for thousands of years attributed its construction to giants. At Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, structures predating Stonehenge by 6,000 years show a level of engineering precision that conventional history insists should not have existed at that point in human development. These are not coincidences easily dismissed. They are physical echoes of a memory that refuses to fade, a memory of something ancient, something powerful, something that walked the earth before the flood and, according to Scripture itself, did not fully disappear after it. If your spirit feels unsettled right now, that is not an accident. It is the same unease that made ancient scribes preserve this story instead of letting it disappear from memory. This channel exists for exactly that feeling, for the moments when you sense there is more beneath the surface of Scripture than you were ever taught to look for. If that resonates with you, subscribe now, because every week we uncover another thread of this hidden history, connecting apocryphal texts, ancient prophecy, and buried truth back to the word you thought you already knew. For those of you who want to go even deeper than any single video can take you, we have poured years of research into something special, a premium illustrated biblical mystery guide called the Forbidden Book of Enoch. It walks you, page by page, through the fall of the Watchers, the true nature of the Nephilim, and the world that existed before the flood, with illustrations that bring these ancient beings and places to life in a way words alone cannot. It is the resource so many of you have asked for, the one that finally connects every scattered piece into something whole. You will find the link waiting in the very first comment pinned below this video, and once you open it, you will understand why so many in this community call it the missing chapter of their own faith. The flood was supposed to end it. That was the entire point of the judgment described in Genesis 6. God looking upon the earth, seeing that every imagination of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually, and grieving that he had made man on the earth. The corruption described there was not ordinary sin. It was something specific enough, something unnatural enough, that it required the wiping clean of an entire world. Noah alone, Scripture tells us, was perfect in his generations, a phrase Hebrew scholars have long debated, some suggesting it refers not simply to moral righteousness, but to genetic purity, an unbroken human bloodline untouched by the corruption spreading through the pre-flood world. If that reading is correct, it reframes the entire story. The flood was not only a punishment for wickedness, it may have been a surgical removal of a bloodline that was never supposed to exist, one that threatened to overwrite what it meant to be fully human. And yet Numbers 13 tells us plainly that the sons of Anak, giants, descendants of the Nephilim, were still walking the land of Canaan centuries later. Something survived. Something got through. The question that has haunted careful readers of Scripture for generations is simple. How? The Book of Enoch offers an answer that most churches never teach. According to the text, when the flood came, the spirits of the slain Nephilim did not simply vanish. Their physical bodies died in the waters, but Enoch describes their spirits departing from their bodies and becoming something new, wandering, disembodied entities with no place in heaven and no place among the dead. Enoch calls them evil spirits, roaming the earth, causing affliction, without judgment until the great day of the end. This detail matters enormously, because it means the bloodline was not only a matter of flesh and blood passed down through generations. It became something spiritual as well, something that could influence humanity long after the physical giants themselves were gone. But the flesh and bloodline did not disappear either. Genesis 10 and 11 describe the descendants of Noah spreading out across the earth after the flood, populating the regions we now call Canaan, Mesopotamia, and beyond. It is in Canaan, specifically, where the giant clans reappear in the biblical record with startling consistency. The Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, The Zamzummim. Deuteronomy chapter 2 names them one by one, almost as if the author wanted future readers to understand these were not myths, but distinct, documented peoples encountered directly by Israel's ancestors. Deuteronomy 3 describes Og, king of Bashan, as the last remnant of the Rephaim, whose iron bedstead measured over 13 feet in length. This is not poetic exaggeration tucked into a minor psalm. This is a detailed, geographically specific historical account, embedded in the same books that record the Exodus and the giving of the law. How does a bloodline survive a global flood meant to erase it? One theory, drawn from later apocryphal tradition, including passages in the Book of Jubilees, suggests the corruption did not end with a single event on Mount Hermon before the flood. Jubilees describes evil spirits continuing to lead humanity astray even after Noah's time, to the point where Noah himself prayed for protection over his descendants, and where roughly 1/10 of these spirits were permitted to remain under the authority of a being called Mastema in order to continue testing and corrupting mankind. If this tradition holds any weight, it suggests the mechanism was never fully shut down. It was restrained, limited, but not eliminated, leaving a door open for the same corruption to resurface generation after generation. Mount Hermon itself carries weight in this story that most believers never stop to consider. It was the specific location named in the Book of Enoch as the site where the 200 watchers descended and bound themselves by oath. Centuries later, this same mountain sits at the northern edge of the region controlled by Og of Bashan, the giant king. It sits near Caesarea Philippi, the very location where Jesus, in Matthew 16, asked his disciples who men said he was, and where he first spoke of building his church against which the gates of hell would not prevail. Many scholars now believe this location was chosen deliberately, that Christ stood at the very gates associated with the ancient corruption of Genesis 6 and declared his authority over it directly, in the shadow of the mountain where the rebellion began. This is the pattern Scripture keeps circling back to. Corruption enters through a specific point. It spreads, takes root, and multiplies beyond its original boundary. Judgment falls, but never total erasure. Some remnant survives, hidden in bloodlines, in territories in spiritual influence that outlast the physical bodies destroyed by flood or sword. David's confrontation with Goliath in 1 Samuel 17 was not simply a battle between a shepherd boy and an oversized soldier. Goliath was explicitly identified as being from Gath, one of the last strongholds of the Anakim after Joshua's conquest of Canaan, according to Joshua 11. The giant bloodline had been driven out, scattered, reduced, but not destroyed. It found refuge among the Philistines and resurfaced generations later on a battlefield in the valley of Elah, forcing Israel's greatest king to confront, quite literally, the descendants of the very corruption that the flood was meant to end forever. Archaeologists working sites across the ancient Near East continue to uncover skeletal remains and architectural evidence that defy easy explanation within conventional timelines, though such findings remain fiercely debated within mainstream academic circles. What cannot be debated is the consistency of the textual record itself. Hebrew scripture, apocryphal writings, and surrounding ancient Near Eastern literature, all preserving fragments of the same underlying memory. A bloodline, a corruption, a remnant that refused to disappear quietly into history, resurfacing again and again at exactly the moment Scripture chooses to record it. Consider also the strange wording used throughout Deuteronomy chapter 3, where the land of the Rephaim is described almost as its own category of territory, distinct from the surrounding regions occupied by ordinary nations. 60 cities, walled and fortified, belonged to Og alone. 60, not a scattered handful of tribal settlements, but an organized, fortified civilization, ruled by a single king whose physical stature was considered remarkable enough to record for future generations centuries after his defeat. Josephus, writing his Antiquities of the Jews long after the events themselves, references the same giant clans, describing them as men of extraordinary size and strength, whose very existence troubled the Israelites sent to scout the land. When multiple independent sources, Hebrew scripture, Jewish historical tradition, and surrounding apocryphal literature, converge on the same detail, the honest response is not dismissal. It is attention. When Israel finally stood at the edge of the Promised Land, the command they received was unlike anything given for any other conquest recorded in Scripture. Deuteronomy 7 instructed them to utterly destroy certain nations, to make no covenant with them, to show them no mercy. Most conquered peoples throughout the ancient Near East were absorbed, enslaved, or taxed. These particular nations were to be devoted to complete destruction. Why would a covenant of mercy, a God who forgave Nineveh and spared Rahab, issue such an absolute command against these specific peoples and no others? The answer, according to a growing body of biblical scholarship, lies precisely in the bloodline this entire account has been tracing. The nations named for destruction, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and above all the giant clans embedded among them, were not simply idol worshippers among many idol-worshipping nations. Scripture treats them as categorically different. Genesis 15, in God's covenant promise to Abraham centuries earlier, specifically states that the fourth generation of his descendants would return to this land because, as the text says, the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet full, as if something specific was accumulating, growing toward a measurable threshold that would eventually justify total judgment, echoing precisely the language used to describe the corruption that led to the flood itself. Numbers 13, when the 12 spies return from scouting Canaan, records their report in language that goes far beyond ordinary military intimidation. They describe the land as devouring its inhabitants, and they describe men of great stature, giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the Nephilim. This is the only place in the entire Hebrew Bible where the word Nephilim appears outside of Genesis 6, and its reappearance here is not accidental. The spies were not exaggerating out of fear alone. They were identifying by name the same corrupted bloodline that had existed before the flood, now flourishing again in the very land Israel was commanded to enter and cleanse. Joshua's campaign against these giant clans receives careful, almost meticulous documentation. Joshua 11 records the destruction of the Anakim from the hill country of Judah, from Debir, from Anab, from all the mountains of Israel, with a striking exception noted immediately afterward. None remained in the land of the children of Israel, the text says, but some remained in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod, 3 Philistine cities. This single verse explains, more clearly than any other, exactly how the bloodline survived the conquest that was supposed to eliminate it. It did not vanish. It relocated, folding itself into Philistine society along the coastal plain, hidden in plain sight among a people who would remain thorns in Israel's side for centuries to come. This is precisely why Goliath matters so much more than a simple story of courage overcoming size. First, Samuel 17 describes him as being from Gath, one of the 3 cities specifically named in Joshua 11 as a refuge for the surviving Anakim. His height, measured at 6 cubits and a span, translates to roughly 9.5 feet by most calculations, though some ancient manuscript traditions record a slightly shorter but still extraordinary stature. His armor alone weighed, by the text's own account, over 125 pounds. This was not simply an unusually large soldier. According to the bloodline, this account is traced from Genesis 6 through the flood, through Canaan's conquest, through the scattering into Philistine territory. Goliath stood on that battlefield as a living remnant of the corruption the flood was sent to end. David's victory, then, becomes something larger than a triumph of faith over fear. It becomes a direct confrontation between the covenant line of promise and the ancient bloodline of rebellion. The same conflict first introduced in Genesis 6, replayed on a battlefield in the valley of Elah roughly 1,000 years later. 2 Samuel 21 records that Goliath was not the last of his kind. 4 other giants are named specifically as descendants of the giant in Gath, killed one by David's mighty men in later battles. Ishbi-Benob, whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze. Saph, another unnamed giant with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. Lami, Goliath's own brother, whose spear staff was like a weaver's beam. This detail about extra digits has drawn particular attention from those studying the biblical account of the Nephilim. since ancient Near Eastern texts outside Scripture occasionally describe similar anomalies among legendary figures said to descend from divine or semi-divine unions. Whether coincidence or confirmation, the pattern Scripture presents is consistent and deliberate, a bloodline with distinct recorded physical characteristics, surviving in isolated pockets for centuries after its supposed elimination. By the time these final giants fall in 2 Samuel, the biblical record grows quiet on the subject. No further named Nephilim descendants appear in the historical books that follow, but quiet is not the same as absent. Scripture never explicitly states that the bloodline was fully and finally extinguished, only that its last named representatives were defeated in specific recorded battles. For a text as careful as the Hebrew Bible, to stop naming something without ever declaring its complete end leaves a question hanging over the remainder of Israel's history, and arguably over the remainder of human history as well. Outside the biblical record, the memory of these giant peoples did not fade quickly either. Ammonite tradition, referenced in Deuteronomy 2, called the Rephaim by another name entirely, the Zamzummim, describing them as a people great and many and tall, destroyed by the Lord before the Ammonites, so they might dwell in their place. This is significant because it shows the giant bloodline was not confined to one region or one people group's memory. It surfaced across multiple unrelated cultures throughout the ancient Near East, each preserving its own name and its own account of the same phenomenon: tall, powerful, fortified peoples who occupied the land before being violently displaced. Mesopotamian literature carries echoes of the same memory in its own way, with figures like Gilgamesh described as two-thirds divine, born of a union between a goddess and a mortal king, granted unnatural strength and stature that separated him from ordinary men. Whether these parallel accounts represent independent cultural memory of the same underlying event or simply shared mythological imagination remains a question scholars continue to debate. What is far harder to dismiss is the sheer consistency of the pattern itself, appearing again and again across cultures that had little direct contact with one another, all describing essentially the same thing in different words. Jesus himself made a statement that most readers pass over far too quickly. In Matthew 24, describing the days leading up to his return, he said, "But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." At first glance, this sounds like a simple comparison about moral decline, people eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, unaware of coming judgment. But if the corruption of Genesis 6 was not merely widespread wickedness, if it was specifically the mingling described in those 8 verses, the descent of the Watchers, the rise of the Nephilim, then Christ's own words carry a far heavier implication. He was not simply warning of moral decay. He was warning that the specific conditions of Genesis 6, the conditions that required a flood to correct, would return before his own return. This reframes an entire category of gospel accounts that most churches read purely as stories of healing and mercy, without asking a deeper question underneath them. Why did demons, when confronted by Jesus, react with such specific, desperate language? In Mark 5, the man possessed by the legion of unclean spirits at Gadara cries out, begging Jesus not to torment him before the time. Before the time. Not simply asking for mercy in general, but referencing a specific future appointment, a coming judgment they knew was scheduled but had not yet arrived. Matthew 8 records a nearly identical scene where 2 demon-possessed men cry out, "What have we to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of God? Art thou come hither to torment us before the time?" This is precisely the language used in the Book of Enoch to describe the fate of the fallen Watchers and their spirit offspring. Reserved, bound, awaiting a final day of judgment that had not yet come, yet already fully anticipated by every unclean spirit that encountered Christ directly. Ephesians 6, written by the Apostle Paul, describes the true nature of spiritual warfare in terms that align remarkably well with this framework. "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." High places, not simply an abstract phrase, but a term used throughout the Old Testament to describe specific elevated locations, often mountains, where corrupted worship and spiritual corruption were known to concentrate. Mount Hermon, the very location named in the Book of Enoch as the site of the Watcher's original descent, sits at the literal geographic and spiritual head of this pattern, a mountain later associated in extra-biblical Jewish tradition with the throne of demonic authority over the region. 2 Peter chapter 2, already referenced earlier in this account, does something remarkable in its structure. Peter places the judgment of the fallen angels of Genesis 6 immediately alongside his description of the coming judgment of false teachers in his own generation, as though the two events belong to the same continuous pattern of rebellion and consequence. He writes of God not sparing the angels that sinned, casting them down to hell, delivering them into chains of darkness, and in the very next breath warns that the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptation and to reserve the unjust unto the day of judgment. The ancient rebellion and the present corruption are treated in Peter's own inspired writing as branches of the same tree. This is where the bloodline stops being purely a matter of physical descent and becomes something far more difficult for the modern mind to dismiss. If the Book of Enoch's account holds any truth, the spirits of the Nephilim who died in the flood did not cease to exist. They became a category of being with no home in heaven, no home among the righteous dead, wandering the earth as what Scripture calls unclean spirits, and what later Christian tradition would simply call demons. This would mean the influence of that ancient corruption never required a continuous physical bloodline to persist at all. It could operate spiritually, generation after generation, entering, influencing and afflicting long after the last physically documented giant fell in battle against David's mighty men. The Gospels are saturated with encounters that fit this pattern with uncomfortable precision. The sheer volume of demonic confrontation recorded in Jesus' ministry, compared to the relative scarcity of such accounts throughout the rest of the Old Testament, suggests something was intensifying at exactly the moment of Christ's arrival, as though his presence forced into the open a spiritual conflict that had been operating in the shadows since Genesis 6. Luke 10 records the 70 returning with joy, declaring that even the devils were subject to them through Christ's name, and Jesus responding with a statement of extraordinary weight, "I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven," a fall. The same word, echoing the very meaning embedded in the name Nephilim itself, the fallen ones, now facing, in the ministry of Christ, the beginning of their long-anticipated reckoning. Jude's short epistle, only 25 verses in total, returns to this exact theme with striking urgency, warning his readers about false teachers who had crept in unnoticed among the faithful. He reaches back in the same breath to 3 examples of past judgment: the rebellious angels of Genesis 6, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the unbelieving generation destroyed after the Exodus, treating all 3 as variations of the same underlying pattern: corruption entering among God's people and provoking decisive judgment. Jude even references a direct prophecy from Enoch himself, quoting words not found anywhere in the canonical Old Testament: "Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment upon all." For an apostle writing under inspiration to quote this apocryphal text directly by name suggests the early church regarded its core account of the Watchers and the Nephilim with far more seriousness than most modern believers have ever been taught to consider. What emerges from this pattern is not a closed chapter of ancient history. It is a warning embedded in the very structure of Scripture, the same corruption that required a flood, restrained but never entirely eliminated, resurfacing in bloodlines, in territories, and now, according to Christ's own words, in the spiritual and moral conditions of the generation that will witness his return. Paul's language to Timothy carries the same weight, warning that in the last days perilous times shall come, and describing a moral unraveling that reads almost like a checklist pulled directly from the pre-flood world. Genesis 6 describes men lovers of their own selves without natural affection, fierce despisers of those that are good. The vocabulary changes across the centuries, the underlying pattern does not. Every ancient civilization that scholars have studied in depth carries some version of the same memory. Not a similar story by coincidence, but something closer to a shared inheritance, passed down through cultures that had no direct contact with one another, describing beings of unusual size, unusual strength, and unusual origin who once walked among ordinary men. Greek mythology speaks of the Titans, offspring of divine beings who ruled the earth before being cast down into darkness. Sumerian tablets describe the Anunnaki, powerful beings who descended from the heavens and mingled with humanity. Andean tradition surrounding Tiwanaku and Puma Punku speaks of a race of giants who built enormous stone structures before a great flood reshaped the world. These are not isolated fantasies, invented independently by bored storytellers scattered across history with nothing better to do. They are echoes, scattered across continents, of something ancient enough and significant enough to leave a permanent mark on the collective memory of the human race. Puma Punku itself deserves careful attention here, because what remains at that site in modern Bolivia continues to defy simple explanation. The stone blocks discovered there were cut with such mathematical precision, interlocking with such exact tolerances, that modern engineers using contemporary tools still struggle to fully explain the methods used to produce them. Local Andean legend, recorded long before modern archaeology arrived to study the site, consistently attributed its construction to a race of giants who lived before a great deluge. Halfway around the world, Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey tells a nearly identical story in stone. Radiocarbon dating places its massive carved pillars at roughly 11,500 years old, predating Stonehenge by 6,000 years and predating the invention of writing, pottery, and agriculture as conventional history understands them. And yet the craftsmanship on display, the enormous T-shaped pillars, carved with detailed animal reliefs and organized into deliberate circular formations, reflects a level of sophistication that mainstream timelines insist should not have existed at that point in human development. Baalbek, discussed earlier in this account, remains perhaps the most physically undeniable piece of evidence in this entire pattern. The trilithon, 3 stone blocks forming part of the platform's foundation, each weighs approximately 800 tons. The largest quarried stone at the site, still lying partially cut in the nearby quarry, is estimated at over 1,600 tons. No crane in operation anywhere in the modern world today could lift that stone. Roman engineers who later built their own temple complex atop this platform inherited a foundation they themselves could not have constructed with the technology available to their own empire. Local tradition for millennia attributed the original platform to giants, a detail preserved consistently enough across enough centuries that dismissing it as pure coincidence becomes increasingly difficult the closer one examines the physical evidence still sitting in that Lebanese valley today. Similar megalithic mysteries appear at sites like Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where interlocking stones fit so precisely that not even a blade of grass can slide between them, again attributed by local memory to a race far stronger and far larger than ordinary builders of their era. Skeletal evidence, though far more contested and frequently entangled with exaggerated or fabricated claims circulating online, still carries threads worth examining honestly. Numerous 19th and early 20th century American newspapers, along with regional historical society records, documented the discovery of unusually large human skeletal remains across sites throughout North America, some reportedly measuring well beyond 7 or 8 feet in height. Mound sites across Ohio, West Virginia, and the wider Mississippi River Valley produced repeated independently reported claims of this kind over several generations, long before any coordinated hoax could plausibly explain such a wide geographic spread. Many of these original specimens were poorly documented, lost or destroyed before modern scientific analysis could properly verify them, which understandably fuels skepticism among mainstream researchers today. Yet the sheer geographic spread and historical consistency of these accounts, appearing independently in regional records with no coordination between the communities reporting them, raises a legitimate question about what these communities were actually encountering, even if modern science cannot fully verify every individual claim. Genetics adds a final, more sobering layer to this entire pattern. Modern population genetics confirms something Scripture implied long before any laboratory could test it, that all of humanity descends from a remarkably narrow set of ancestral lines, consistent with a catastrophic bottleneck event in the ancient past. Whatever occurred at the time of the flood, the genetic record does not contradict the idea of humanity passing through an extraordinarily narrow surviving population before spreading out again across the earth. Whether traces of a different corrupted genetic line could have persisted alongside the Noahic bloodline, hidden within specific isolated populations named later in scripture as Anakim, Rephaim, or Emim, remains a question no laboratory has definitively answered, and likely never fully will, given how much physical evidence has been lost, destroyed, or simply never properly examined in the first place. There is also the matter of institutional silence, something researchers in this field bring up often enough that it deserves acknowledgement. The Smithsonian Institution, among others, has faced long-standing accusations dating back over a century of quietly discarding or losing unusually large skeletal remains recovered during early American archaeological digs. Whether this reflects a genuine cover-up or simply the ordinary carelessness and poor record-keeping typical of 19th century field archaeology remains genuinely disputed, and honesty requires admitting that firm documentation on either side is thin. What is not disputed is that mainstream institutions have shown little enthusiasm for revisiting these older reports with modern forensic techniques, leaving the question open rather than closed, regardless of which explanation one finds more plausible. What Scripture leaves us with instead is not laboratory proof in the modern sense, but a consistent, textually reinforced pattern, a bloodline entering through corruption, surviving judgment, resurfacing across recorded history at precisely the intervals the biblical record chooses to name it, right up until the final documented giants fall silent in the pages of 2 Samuel. And perhaps that silence itself is the most important detail of all. Scripture does not close this story with a tidy ending. It simply stops naming names, the way a river disappears underground without ever truly running dry, leaving open the very real possibility that its course continues somewhere beneath the surface of everything that came after, including, if that unease sitting in your chest right now is any indication, the very world you and I are standing in today. The bloodline was never fully erased, only scattered, restrained, and waiting to be understood by those willing to look past the surface of the text. That is exactly why we built the premium illustrated biblical mystery guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch, walking you through every piece of this hidden history, with illustrations that bring the Watchers, the Giants, and the world before the flood to life. You'll find the link in the very first comment pinned below. Thank you for spending this time with us today. If this account moved something in you, subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment telling us what struck you most. More of this hidden history is waiting on your screen right now. Go ahead and keep watching.